In the autumn of 1872, a single headline shook the foundations of American political life. 4 words, printed in a New York newspaper, would bring down some of the most powerful men in the country. Those 4 words were, "The King of Frauds." What lay behind them was a scandal so vast, so meticulously constructed, that it had taken nearly a decade to reach the surface. To understand it, we must travel back to the close of the Civil War, to a nation fractured, exhausted, yet possessed of an extraordinary ambition. The Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862 and 1864 committed the United States government to a project of breathtaking scale. A transcontinental railroad linking the Atlantic world to the Pacific coast. The government offered the Union Pacific Railroad lavish incentives. Land grants of millions of acres and federal bond subsidies of up to $48,000 per mile of track laid. It was, by any measure, an enormous transfer of public wealth into private hands. And wherever large sums of public money flow with limited oversight, temptation follows. The Union Pacific's board of directors understood this well. Among them was a man named Thomas Durant, restless, ambitious, and entirely comfortable with creative accounting. Durant and his colleagues faced a fundamental problem. Building a transcontinental railroad was genuinely expensive. But the profits, if one was clever, could be extracted long before any track was laid. The solution they devised was elegant in its simplicity. They would create a separate construction company, award it contracts to build the railroad, and set those contract prices far above the true cost of the work. The construction company already existed. It was a dormant Pennsylvania corporation called the Crédit Mobilier of America, purchased in 1864 and quietly reorganized for precisely this purpose. The same men who sat on the Union Pacific Board would also, in many cases, be the principal shareholders of Crédit Mobilier. They would, in effect, be awarding themselves contracts and paying themselves with federal money. It was, by any rigorous definition, a conspiracy to defraud the United States government. But in the fluid financial culture of the 1860s, it was treated, by its architects, as merely good business. Into this world stepped Ames, a man of considerable personal substance, and even more considerable political connections. Ames was born in 1804 in Easton, Massachusetts, into a family that manufactured shovels. The Oliver Ames and Sons Company was among the most respected industrial firms in New England. The Ames family fortune was real, earned, and substantial. When Oakes entered Congress as a Republican in 1863, he carried with him a reputation for reliability and practical competence. He was, by all contemporary accounts, a straightforward man. His letters were blunt. His business dealings were transparent. He was not, by nature, a schemer. And yet, in 1865, Oakes Ames agreed to take on the rescue of the Union Pacific Railroad. The company was faltering, its finances chaotic, its construction barely underway. He invested heavily from his own funds, over $1 million by some estimates. His commitment was genuine. He believed in the railroad as a national necessity. But the Union Pacific's inner circle operated by different rules. By the time Ames was fully committed, the Crédit Mobilier scheme was already in motion, and he was being drawn into the center of it. By 1867, Oakes Ames had become the largest single shareholder in Crédit Mobilier. He held the mechanism of the fraud in his own hands, and he was about to make it considerably more dangerous. Crédit Mobilier of America. The name sounded respectable, even distinguished. But behind that polished facade lay one of the most audacious financial deceptions in American history. The company had been purchased and repurposed in 1864 by Thomas Durant and a tight circle of Union Pacific directors. It existed for one purpose: to be paid handsomely for building the railroad they already controlled. Union Pacific would award contracts to Crédit Mobilier. Crédit Mobilier would pocket the difference between cost and payment. The men controlling both companies were the same men. It was a closed loop of greed. The federal government poured money in. Crédit Mobilier siphoned it out. And the public had no idea the mechanism even existed. Construction contracts were wildly inflated. Work that cost $44 million to complete was billed at nearly $94 million. The difference, $50 million, vanished into private hands. In a single year, Crédit Mobilier paid dividends exceeding 300%. Shareholders received returns that no legitimate enterprise could ever produce. Thomas Durant, the architect of much of this machinery, was a man of enormous cunning and appetite. He saw the railroad not as a monument to progress, but as a vehicle for personal enrichment. Durant manipulated routes, padded costs, and bullied rivals. He was the engine of excess at the heart of the Union Pacific, brilliant, ruthless, and almost entirely without scruple. Ames watched all of this unfold, and rather than recoiling, he leaned in. He reorganized Crédit Mobilier's management, injected his own capital, and assumed direct control of its operations. He told himself it was necessary, that someone responsible had to steer the enterprise, that the railroad could not be built without ruthless financing. He was not entirely wrong, but he was not entirely right either. The profits kept flowing, and with each dividend payment, each padded invoice, the scheme grew harder to dismantle, because too many powerful people had grown dependent on it. By 1867, the railroad was pushing across Wyoming and Utah. The iron lines were real. The progress was real. But beneath the engineering triumph, the financial rot was absolute. Congressional oversight was minimal. The legislation that created the Union Pacific had generous provisions and weak enforcement. The insiders had read every clause and exploited every gap. Washington trusted the railroad men. After all, they were building the nation's spine. Surely men doing God's work with iron and steam deserved the benefit of the doubt. That trust was not accidental. It had been carefully cultivated, through dinners, through favors, through quiet conversations in Capitol cloakrooms where money and influence changed hands invisibly. Ames understood the game. As both a congressman and a Crédit Mobilier shareholder, he occupied a uniquely dangerous position. 1 foot in the legislature, 1 foot in the fraud. He began to see that the scheme needed protection, insurance against the day when questions might be asked. The answer, he concluded, was simple. Share the wealth with those who could ask the loudest questions. It was a strategy as old as corruption itself. Make the potential investigators into co-conspirators. Buy their silence not with threats, but with profit. In 1867, Ames began distributing Crédit Mobilier shares to his colleagues in Congress. The transactions were dressed up as ordinary investments. Nothing about them appeared unusual on the surface, but Ames was not selecting recipients randomly. He wrote candidly in a private letter that he was placing the shares where they would do the most good, meaning precisely where they would do the most damage to accountability. Schuyler Colfax, Speaker of the House, soon to be Vice President, accepted shares. A man of warm smiles and public virtue, now quietly bound to the scheme. James G. Blaine, the charismatic Maine congressman with presidential ambitions, was also approached. The shares arrived quietly, wrapped in the language of friendship. James A. Garfield, a future president of the United States, received shares as well. He would later deny it. The ledger told a different story. In all, nearly a dozen sitting congressmen and senators held shares. The railroad's tentacles reached deep into the very body meant to oversee it. Ames kept meticulous records of every transaction. He believed, with remarkable confidence, that he had done nothing wrong. To Ames, this was simply how Washington worked. Relationships, favors, shared prosperity. He saw himself as a builder, not a criminal. But the money flowing through Crédit Mobilier was not his to share. It belonged to the American taxpayer, to the public that had funded every mile of track. Dividends poured out to shareholders, sometimes in cash, sometimes in additional stock. Returns exceeded 300% in a single year. Meanwhile, the actual railroad was being built cheaply. Bridges were under-engineered. Grading was rushed. The public got far less than what it paid for. Thomas Durant, the mastermind behind so much of the fraud, grew bolder. The scheme had survived years without scrutiny. They believed themselves untouchable. Then came the fracture. Henry Macomb, a disgruntled Crédit Mobilier shareholder, believed he had been cheated out of his full allotment of stock. Macomb filed a lawsuit against Ames, and in doing so, he placed the private letters, the letters naming names, into the public court record. Letters in Ames's own handwriting. Letters describing exactly who received shares, how many, and why. The evidence was irrefutable, and now it was public. The letters made their way to a reporter. The story was too enormous to contain. Washington's most powerful men were about to be exposed. The New York Sun, a paper known for aggressive populist journalism, received the letters and prepared to publish. The countdown had begun. It was September 1872. A presidential election was weeks away. The timing could not have been more politically devastating. Colfax was running as vice president on the Grant ticket. Blaine harbored dreams of the White House. Every name in those letters had something enormous to lose. Ames, back in Massachusetts, received word that publication was imminent. He had believed the arrangement was safe. He had miscalculated spectacularly. The web he had so carefully woven, share by share, name by name, was about to unravel in the most public way imaginable. The king of frauds. That was what the New York Sun would call it. A headline that would echo through American history. September 4th, 1872. The New York Sun hit the streets with a headline that stopped the nation cold. The king of frauds. How the Crédit Mobilier bought its way through Congress. The story named names, senators, congressmen. The sitting vice president of the United States. No one of consequence had been spared. The source was Henry Macomb, a disgruntled investor who had sued Ames over disputed shares. His lawyers had obtained private letters, and now those letters were public. In those letters, written in Ames's own hand, he had described placing shares where they would do, quote, the most good. The phrase became instantly infamous. Washington erupted. The story broke just weeks before the 1872 presidential election. The timing could not have been more devastating for the Republican establishment. Schuyler Colfax, vice president and candidate for re-election, issued a furious public denial. He claimed he had never received a single share of Crédit Mobilier stock. But Ames's letters told a different story. They listed Colfax by name, 20 shares. The contradiction was stark, and the public noticed. James Blaine, Speaker of the House, moved quickly to distance himself. He declared publicly he had returned the shares and had profited not at all from the arrangement. James Garfield of Ohio, a rising star of the Republican Party, also denied wrongdoing, though he had received a cash dividend of $300, a fact he struggled to explain away. Across the country, newspaper editorial boards thundered with outrage. Cartoonists depicted congressmen stuffing their pockets with railroad gold while the public watched helplessly. Despite the scandal, Ulysses Grant won re-election in November 1872. But the story would not die. Congress had no choice but to act. In December 1872, the House of Representatives convened the Poland Committee, a special investigative panel tasked with untangling the entire Crédit Mobilier affair. The committee was chaired by Luke Poland of Vermont, a respected former judge known for his methodical, unsparing approach to evidence. He would prove a formidable examiner. Subpoenas were issued. Witnesses were summoned. For the first time, the men who had built the Transcontinental Railroad in secret were compelled to speak under oath. Oakes Ames himself appeared before the committee. He arrived composed, almost defiant, certain that the payments had been legitimate investments, not bribes. He insisted he had done nothing wrong. The shares were sold at fair value. His colleagues had invested as private citizens. There was no conspiracy, he argued, only good business. But the committee pressed harder. If there was no conspiracy, why had the shares been distributed so deliberately to men sitting on congressional railroad committees? Ames had no clean answer. Other witnesses contradicted each other openly. Colfax's testimony clashed with the ledger records. Garfield's recollection of events shifted between sessions. The hearing room crackled with accusation. Meanwhile, the press kept the nation riveted. Every day brought fresh dispatches. Every testimony opened new contradictions. America had never witnessed a congressional scandal of this scale before. By January 1873, the Poland Committee had heard enough. A verdict was forming, and for Oakes Ames, the news would be devastating. The Poland Committee convened its final deliberations in the bitter cold of February 1873. The capital's great halls, usually alive with political theater, now felt heavy with something rarer: consequence. Luke Poland, the Vermont congressman who chaired the committee, was a careful man. He had spent months sifting through testimony, ledgers, and letters. Now he was ready to render judgment. The committee's report, formally presented to the full House of Representatives, was damning. Oakes Ames, it concluded, had deliberately distributed shares of Crédit Mobilier to fellow legislators to corruptly influence their votes. James Brooks, a Democratic congressman from New York, who had also received shares, was named alongside Ames. Two men from opposite parties, bound together by the same corrupt bargain. On February 27, 1873, the full House voted. The result was devastating. Oakes Ames was formally censured, publicly rebuked by the very body he had served for nearly a decade. James Brooks received the same censure. Within weeks, broken by the disgrace, Brooks would suffer a physical collapse. He died just months later, the scandal having consumed him entirely. Schuyler Colfax, the sitting Vice President of the United States, was not censured, but the evidence against him was powerful, and the committee's language was scathing. His political career was finished. Colfax had been Grant's first vice president. He had stood at the very pinnacle of American power. Now he was a punchline. A cautionary tale of ambition, destroyed by a few shares of stock. James Garfield, the Ohio congressman who would one day become president, escaped formal censure, but only barely. The hearings had exposed his testimony as conveniently vague. The stain would follow him for years. James Blaine, the powerful Speaker of the House, also escaped censure. For now. But the Crédit Mobilier shadow lingered over his ambitions, and would surface again when he sought the presidency years later. The newspapers, which had ignited the scandal, now feasted on its wreckage. Editorial cartoonists portrayed Ames as a circus ringmaster juggling bags of stolen federal gold. Back in northeastern Massachusetts, Oakes Ames returned to the town he had shaped. The factories, the churches, the railroad halls, all bearing his family's name. But the welcome had turned cold. He was 68 years old. He had spent his entire adult life building shovels, railroads, political connections, a family dynasty. Now the censure branded everything he had built. Friends grew distant. Business partners reconsidered their ties. The man who had once commanded rooms with confident authority now moved through his own world like a ghost, present but diminished. He wrote letters defending himself, to colleagues, to newspapers, to anyone who would read them. He insisted he had acted no differently than 100 others in Washington. Perhaps he was right, but the censure had made him the face of it all. His defenders pointed out the uncomfortable truth, that nearly every man in Washington had accepted favors of one kind or another from the railroad interests. Crédit Mobilier was a symptom, not an anomaly. The broader investigation, the Wilson Committee, which examined the financial records of Union Pacific itself, confirmed staggering losses to the public. Tens of millions in federal loans had vanished into private hands. The Transcontinental Railroad itself still stood, an engineering marvel stretching from the Missouri River to the Pacific. The iron rails were real. The golden spike was real. Only the money had been stolen. For the American public, the scandal crystallized something they had long suspected: that the great machinery of government and capital were entangled in ways that served the powerful and cost the ordinary citizen everything. The Gilded Age had arrived, glittering on the surface, rotten at its core. And Oakes Ames, disgraced and aging in his Massachusetts home, had become its first great cautionary symbol. The worst, for him, was still to come. Back in northeastern Massachusetts, Oakes Ames moved through the rooms of his family estate like a man already half gone. The censure vote had stripped something essential from him, not merely his reputation, but his identity. He had spent 40 years building a name, and Congress had dismantled it in a single afternoon. Neighbors who once tipped their hats now looked away. The town that had sent him to Washington with pride now spoke his name in hushed, complicated tones. He attempted to manage his affairs, the shovel works, the investments, the correspondence that still arrived in stacks. But those closest to him could see the change. His handwriting, once firm and commanding, had grown uncertain. His appetite failed him. He sat for long hours in his study, staring at documents that seemed to offer no answers to the only question that now consumed him: how had it come to this? A man who believed he was building America had instead hollowed it out from within. In early May of 1873, just 3 months after the censure, Oakes Ames suffered a severe stroke. He collapsed at his home in Northeaston, the weight of a ruined legacy pressing down as surely as any physical force. Doctors were summoned. Family gathered. But the man who had once lobbied presidents, commanded the floor of Congress, and overseen the most ambitious construction project in American history lay diminished, unable to speak the thoughts that churned behind his failing eyes. On May 8, 1873, Oakes Ames died. He was 63 years old. The obituaries were measured, careful, acknowledging his decades of genuine service, while noting always the cloud that had descended over his final chapter. Some papers were brutal. The New York Sun, the very publication that had destroyed him, ran a brief notice with the efficiency of a man crossing a finished item from a ledger. History had rendered its first verdict, and it was not kind. The men he had protected fared better, and that perhaps was the cruelest irony of all. Schuyler Colfax returned to Indiana and lived another 18 years, lecturing on the Chautauqua Circuit, carefully recasting himself as a statesman wronged by association. James Garfield eventually ascended to the presidency of the United States in 1881, the Crédit Mobilier shadow trailing him into the White House, though it never caught him fully. Power, it seemed, had its own immunities. What the Crédit Mobilier scandal had exposed was not merely the greed of a handful of men, it was the architecture of impunity itself. The railroads had been built with public money and public land, and the men entrusted to steward that public faith had treated it as a personal treasury. Congress investigated itself and found itself only mildly guilty. The system, designed to check power, had been compromised by the very power it was meant to check. Americans were left with a reckoning that had no clean resolution. The Crédit Mobilier affair became America's template for corporate corruption, the reference point against which every future scandal would be measured. It seeded distrust between citizens and their government that reformers would spend the next half-century trying to repair. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Sherman Antitrust Act, all of them carried, somewhere in their origins, the long shadow of what Ames and his colleagues had done in the name of progress. Disgrace, it turned out, could also be a kind of inheritance. Somewhere in Wyoming, rising above the high plains along the old Union Pacific line, there still stands a massive granite pyramid, 60 feet tall, built in 1882 to honor Oakes and Oliver Ames. For over a century, it stood alone on the windswept ridge, a monument to the men who drove the iron road across a continent. It is one of the most remote monuments in America, and perhaps that is fitting, a tribute to grand ambition, stranded far from the seats of power that ambition corrupted. The golden spike was driven, the railroad was built, and the bill, in the end, was paid by everyone who was never invited to the table. Pause. If history like this moves you, subscribe. There is always another story waiting to be told.